perhaps misleading the public afterward. We have Fox team coverage tonight. Correspondent Rich Edson is at the White House, where the administration downplayed the report today. We also have House Select Benghazi Committee Chairman Trey Gowdy and committee member Susan Brooks here to answer some questions about their findings. But we begin with Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge, who spent the day going through this 800-page report. Catherine.
Brett, the Republican report for the first time identified a key meeting at the White House on the night of the attacks at approximately 7:30 p.m. Eastern, which included then Secretary of State Clinton, who was the only cabinet member who participated, and the focus was not on immediate military help.
Nothing could have reached Benghazi because nothing was ever headed to Benghazi. No U.S. military asset was ever deployed to Benghazi despite the order of the Secretary of Defense at 7 o'clock that night.
At that time, the attack had 5 hours yet to go. Foreign Service Officer Sean Smith was dead. Ambassador Chris Stevens was missing. And former Navy SEALs Ty Woods and Glenn Doherty, who would later die defending the CIA base, were still alive. But the administration worried about how the Libyans would react.
They're as concerned, actually more concerned, about whether they're going to be offending the Libyan government by how it is that this rescue is proposed to take place than whether the rescue is actually successful.
And there was concern the Libyans would find the rescue team's military uniforms insulting. One commander testified he and his Marines changed in and out of their uniforms 4 times.
That if it was your son or your daughter or one of your family members or friends who were on that ground that night and you watched the actions in Washington, D.C., you'd have every right to be disgusted.
Charles Wood's son Ty died protecting State Department and CIA personnel.
The report found that the administration was concerned about offending the Libyans.
Well, I don't think that that's really even an issue. Hillary, she took credit for invading Libya. When we bombed them, when we went in without permission from the host country, no, she wasn't afraid of that.
Discussion of the obscure anti-Islam video the White House would wrongly tie the attacks also dominated the meeting, taking up 5 of the 10 action items.
I have forgiven all the people that were involved in this, okay? But there are times when tears come to my eyes. I can't help it.
Wood said he's disappointed the report does not explain who blocked the order to help.
They're definitely making a very concerted effort not to allow the American public or Congress to know why they didn't rescue.
And the pressure was on Clinton, who wanted the Benghazi outpost to be permanent, with an announcement 1 month before the November 2012 election.
Now they got a terrorist attack, and they have to mislead the American people because it's 56 days before an election.
None of the investigations have answered a central question, which is why the U.S. was in Benghazi with such a significant CIA presence. Chairman Gowdy said today that they investigated whether there was a covert weapons operation at one point to arm the Libyan opposition, but the president and the White House would not cooperate with those questions, Brett.
Thank you, Catherine. The White House discounted the Select Committee's Benghazi report as a waste of time and money. This despite the report finding several missteps by the administration before, during, and after the attack that killed 4 Americans. As you just saw, correspondent Rich Edson reports from the White House on the Obama administration's attempt to downplay the report overall.
2 years, $7 million, all politics. That's the Obama administration's assessment of the House Select Committee on Benghazi's report.
It's unfortunate that the death of 4 Americans would be subject to that kind of political fantasizing. But that is the state of the Republican Party these days.
White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest addressed questions about the specifics of the report by dismissing the entire effort as a politics-driven expedition to discredit the administration and then Secretary of State and the current presumptive Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton.
I'll leave it to others to characterize this report, but I think it's pretty clear it's time to move on.
Much of the Republican report focuses on the White House response. Days after the 2012 attack, the administration deployed its then ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice, to television networks to explain what had happened. The Benghazi report claims political and communications officials prepared her for those appearances and, quote, nobody from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Department of Defense, or Central Intelligence Agency agency participated in the call. It cites an email from aide Ben Rhodes discussing that call, quote, to underscore that these protests are rooted in an internet video and not a broader failure of policy. Rice then denied on television the attack was planned and claimed it was a spontaneous reaction to a hateful anti-Muslim video. The Republican report cites two State Department officials summarizing Rice's assessment as, quote, off the reservation.
It was common for senior communications officials in the White House to be involved in preparing senior administration officials for television appearances. The intelligence community, even in testifying here, has acknowledged that there was conflicting intelligence information that they were sifting through in the immediate aftermath of the attack. I don't think that's new.
In a separate report, committee Democrats say that security in Benghazi was, quote, woefully inadequate because of decisions made by officials at the State Department. Brett?
Rich Edson live on the North Lawn. Rich, thanks. Join me now to talk about the report, two of its authors, House Select Committee Chairman Trey Gowdy and committee member Susan Brooks. Thank you both for being here. You know, you come on a day, and obviously we have all this breaking news with this attack in Turkey. A lot of this report, the pre-attack, deals with the security of facilities around the world. Congresswoman Brooks, you used to be on the House Homeland Security Committee. As you look at these attacks today and you think about this report, are we changing things? Do we need to change things in the wake of this terrorist threat?
After 9/11, I was actually appointed U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Indiana and was part of helping stand up TSA. And I will tell you that Homeland Security has a subcommittee focused on Transportation Security Administration and our security at airports. But when incidents continue to happen at airports, it does cause us as a government to continue to question whether or not we're doing enough. And that's what the oversight of Congress is about. It's about asking those questions of the administration, of Homeland Security, to make sure that they're monitoring the threats, that they're doing all that they can, and that we provide them the tools to make sure they're keeping these types of threats from the homeland.
And in this Benghazi report, that lack of security at the facilities was one of the biggest dropped balls, you said.
It certainly was. I was very focused on what happened pre-attack, and there were numerous requests for additional diplomatic security personnel, numerous requests that were ignored to strengthen the physical security of our compound, and those were ignored. And it was a huge problem for those on the ground. And I think the American people do need to ask those questions. Why were they not given when it was a high threat post, when we knew there was dramatic amount of security incidents that had happened in Benghazi, including 2 to our own compound, 1 in April and 1 in June of 2012. An IED had gone off, had been thrown into our compound in June of 2012, and yet officials in Washington continue to deny requests for more security.
Mr. Chairman, you heard Catherine's report. The president orders the military assets to move, to do everything they can. Defense Secretary Panetta orders military assets to do everything they can to Benghazi, and yet nothing goes. Why? Well,
someone changed Secretary Panetta's order, and I think General Carter-Ham is a good place to start. That's where we started. You may recall we were ridiculed for talking to him again, but that's because he wasn't asked the right questions the first 6 times he was talked to. He believes they were evacuating, Brett. He can't tell you the basis.
Orders, you mean?
No, Carter-Ham believed that our guys in Benghazi were evacuating. So whatever assets were going to be deployed to Benghazi, he decided to deploy them to Tripoli instead. He believed that the fighting had subsided and that we were evacuating. Now, when you press him on what informed and instructed that belief, it certainly wasn't any information on the ground, because the guys in the firefight did not believe the fighting had subsided, and they did not believe we were evacuating.
But the focus on this deputies meeting at 7:30, where Hillary Clinton is a part of that, as well as the White House Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough, and others. The discussion after the orders focus on, at least in part, whether the new Libyan government had given permission for the U.S. military to intervene. Did that play a role in this whole?
Well, they say not. There's a lot of discussion about diplomatic clearance. They say not, but yet it's interesting, no wheel turned until we got diplomatic security clearance. So they say it wasn't an issue, but nonetheless, no asset moved until that permission was acquired. So I would rather have the argument that it was an issue because nothing happened until they secured it.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to just put up the New York Times assessment of this. The headline reads, House Benghazi report finds no new evidence of wrongdoing by Hillary Clinton. It is not alone in that headline, and you're getting a lot of people saying there's no new evidence.
Well, the New York Times made up their mind about a year ago when they called for our committee to be disbanded, and if you had believed the House Democrats in the New York Times, you would never have known who evacuated us from the annex. You would never know that no asset was headed towards Benghazi. You would never know that not a single wheel was turning when the last 2 Americans were killed. You would not know the corroboration that the Secretary of State was going back to Libya in the fall of 2012. You would not know about the $20 million fund that she approved in August of 2012 before our facility was attacked in September of 2012. Read the report. I wish the New York Times had read it before they wrote the headline.
So when you hear, Congresswoman, that nothing's new in this report, what do you think and what's your response?
Well, I certainly hope that the American people read the report.
What do you take away from it? What's most important for you?
Well, besides what our chairman said about the military posture and the fact that they were not only not prepared to respond, but then that they did not respond to Benghazi, I think the failed policy in Libya, and the fact, and even President Obama admitted that the worst mistake of his presidency was by failing to prepare for the day after. All of the focus of the State Department was on toppling Gaddafi, and toppling Gaddafi, as during the hearing in which I questioned Secretary Clinton, there was a massive amount of communication that went to her from a number of people about prior to Gaddafi falling. But after Gaddafi fell, there was very little attention given to the people who remained there, our people, in Benghazi, in Tripoli, and then in Benghazi.
You say in this report that there's the Gaddafi people who, allies, essentially, who rescued our people. But you also say that the only guy who's been arrested, Abu Khatallah, who's now in custody, was standing next to one of the people who rescued our guys from the annex.
Well, those are 2 different groups. He was standing next to a different Libyan militia. They left. They left to go on the other side of town to get more weapons. Khatallah was standing next to the head of a militia who did not lift a finger to help our guys evacuate. One of our guys working the phone had to call a group no one had heard of before. They weren't familiar with. That's who came and saved our guys. It wasn't any of the groups that we were building relationships with over the past 18 months. So those are 2 separate groups, Brett.
The bottom line here, you were asked today whether Secretary Clinton had lied, and you declined to talk about that. But yet a few moments later, you said Susan Rice, in your judgment, had made up things out of whole cloth in those 5 Sunday talk shows, talking about that. So people are wondering, are you somehow bending over backwards to avoid the politics of this presidential race by not characterizing what you see as misstatements by Secretary Clinton?
I don't think so. I was not asked to investigate Secretary Clinton. Susan Rice was the person that they chose to send on 5 separate talk shows. So there's a lot of fodder to critique from her. With respect to Secretary Clinton, we spent a lot of time discussing that first statement that she issued on behalf of the United States government and what evidence was available to her and what evidence she chose. So our report involves Secretary Clinton where it should involve Secretary Clinton. We just mentioned her name less times than our Democrat colleagues do. So I don't think I said Susan Rice lied. I think I said I'd rather...
Made up out of whole cloth.
Well, you look at the talking points, and her comments do not resemble the talking points that were provided to her.
And last thing, the Democrats and the White House pointing to Mike Rogers' committee, Intel chairman, and saying that he essentially found different findings than you all found. Are you saying that his report was not good and that people shouldn't take him seriously? Yes. Well, they can take him seriously if they want to, but 2 of his Intel committee members were on our Benghazi committee. They didn't sign his report, they signed ours. You don't issue a final definitive report without interviewing eyewitnesses. He didn't interview the eyewitnesses. He didn't even interview the guy that we found that told us who evacuated our folks from the annex. And those who did interview, he interviewed them in groups. And as a former U.S. attorney and a former federal prosecutor, you never interview witnesses in groups. So I'll let Chairman Rogers defend his report. 2 of his HIPSI
House Intel Committee members were also on our report. They didn't sign his, they did sign ours.
Is this the definitive word?
And I would say 9 people, our investigation, we interviewed over 100 people, 9 of whom were actually eyewitnesses to the attacks that had never been interviewed by any congressional committee before. We interviewed 81 people who had never been interviewed by congressional committees. And so while the other committees that had worked on this, their work product was not